Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our latest edition of our Basel IV-Channel. Today, with a focus on the new disclosure requirements. As you might know, the Basel II framework introduced the system of the three-pillar approach. We have the first pillar of the minimum capital requirements. We have the second pillar with the supervisory review and evaluation process and requirements for the internal risk management practice for banks. And last but not least, we have pillar 3 with the disclosure requirements. While in the previous episodes of the Basel IV-Channel, we were mostly focusing on pillar 1 requirements because, as you all know, Basel IV is changing the approaches for the calculation of risk-weighted assets for all types of risks. So no matter if we're talking here about credit risk, market risk, or operational risk, all approaches are going to be changed. And also no matter if we're talking here about standardized approaches or if we're talking about internal models, they will be all changed. And today we are talking about the new pillar 3 requirements, the disclosure requirements. Please give me the possibility to introduce myself. My name is Martin Neisen, as you probably already know from the previous versions of the Basel IV-Channel. I'm a partner in PwC in Frankfurt, and apart from leading the regulatory management practice here in Frankfurt, I'm also leading our global Basel IV initiative. Today, again, I'm not alone. I have two experts with me on the topic disclosure. The first one is Rivaan. Rivaan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Martin. It's good to be with you on the Basel IV-Channel. My name is Rivaan Roopnarain. I'm a senior manager in the risk and regulatory practice in London, specializing in prudential regulation.
Thanks a lot, Rivaan. And the second expert is Peter. Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. So my name is Peter Khoury. I'm a director in the prudential regulatory practice in London as well. So I've been leading a lot of the efforts in terms of pillar 3 within the local market here.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Before we start with the new disclosure requirements, please give me the opportunity to give you a quick introduction in the overall topic of disclosure requirements. The disclosure requirements were introduced with the Basel II framework. As I mentioned before, we have the 3 pillars. And directly after the first day when the banks had to publish their disclosure reports, most of the supervisors, depending always on the country and the territory, of course, they were not really satisfied with the disclosure reports provided by the banks. And of course, they received the feedback that they should enhance their disclosure practice. In the year 2008, supervisors were more or less, again, I don't want to say disappointed, but they still saw a lot of possibility for improvement of the disclosure report, and they asked the banks, hey, if you don't improve your disclosure reports, we have to give you more strict disclosure guidelines. But then, as you all know, the financial crisis appeared and everybody was focusing a little bit on other topics, both the banks because they had the problems and the supervisors because they had to deal with these problems. So the topic disclosure requirements were lost a little bit out of the focus. But then in 2012, supervisors were rediscovering the topic disclosure requirements. And again, they made quality assurance on the disclosure reports for major banks. And again, they found a lot of possibilities for improvement. And they again gave a warning, so to say, to the banks that they should improve their disclosure report. If not, they have to develop more detailed disclosure requirements. And as you can imagine, it happened how it happened. The disclosure reports, of course, improved a little bit, but not so sufficient as the supervisors wanted to have them. So they came up with new disclosure requirements. And today, Basel IV-Channel is going to be about these new disclosure requirements. So I would like to hand over to Peter to give you a first overview about the disclosure requirements.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I suppose where it's useful to start is the vision of these new Pillar 3 disclosures. So where the regulator is coming from is they would like the Pillar 3 disclosures to be as prominent as the financial statements. So, I mean, the regulator would argue that some of the regulatory metrics presented in that document are probably more important than the financial ones. So this is why the working group worked on revamping the existing Pillar 3 disclosures. If we move swiftly to the next slide, so the initial revamp of these existing disclosure was to be done in 3 phases. So I'll talk you through the different phases and where we are on each one of those. So if we take phase 1, the final standards were published in January 2015, and the implementation date from Basel was end of 2016. This initial phase covers predominantly credit risk, counterparty credit risk, and some market risk. It is worth noting that in Europe, the EBA guidelines implementing phase 1 were only finalized at the end of 2016, and this is why the implementation date for Europe was decided end of 2017, with some institutions required to early adopt some of these templates. So if we move to the phase 2, phase 2 final standards are expected soon. The consultation paper was published in June 2016. This paper is an interesting one because it does consider new topics that were not tackled by Pillar 3 before. These topics include TLAC, IRRBB, FRTB, hypothetical RWA. So it is worth noting that a number of these topics are still not yet finalized, which is making the preparation for implementation of these templates particularly challenging. And if we convert to phase 3, there is still uncertainty there. We are expecting a consultation paper later in the year. There is speculation over what this consultation paper will cover, but we expect it to cover topics that have not yet been tackled. Asset encumbrance is one, potentially. Sovereign exposure is another, but really it will probably consider as well any other Basel initiative that would have been covered by then. To dive a bit more, I suppose the following slides, we will try to give you a flavor of the first 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2. So on slide 5, we are outlining really the topics that are covered within phase 1, the number of templates, as well as the disclosure frequency. It is worth highlighting that we've based this table on the EBA guidelines for illustrative purposes, but those do not significantly differ from the Basel phase 1 templates. The 2 key messages I'd like to take away from this is there are a lot of new templates. So 48 templates is quite onerous. Half of them are fixed templates. I know the purpose of that is effectively to allow comparability amongst institutions, but it does not provide flexibility to institutions to alter information. And the other thing is frequency. So you'll see the majority of those are semi-annual templates, and some are even quarterly, which is a step change for the majority of the institutions, particularly the ones that did not report quarterly Pillar 3 disclosures in the past. What is the big challenge in terms of phase 1? I suppose we tried to bucket them in 2. Let's talk about the big changes, which are challenges on their own, and then we'll focus on the challenges. The main changes that we see within the phase 1 that institutions are grappling with is starting with the reconciliation. This is the most challenging because it is a reconciliation between the financial data and the risk types, and it is quite a granular one. It is proving tricky because of the different permutations the data go through. It's particularly complex when you talk about models, and when you jump into models, what do you consider those jumps? Are they reconciling items? Are they a complete shift? Do you start with netting or gross? There's a number of things to consider when you're thinking of that reconciliation. And the reality is, even the most large institutions who have done some form of reconciliation back to the financials, they've done it at such a high level that this granular, detailed reconciliation is proving difficult to them. If we move to the next point, it's RWA flow statements. This is targeted to institutions who have models. The main challenge there has been the distinguishing between model change and methodology change. A lot of the information are being reported to regulators at the moment, but it's just trying to reconcile your underlying data of those versus what you've reported to the regulator versus what you've published before. It is not an easy task. So a particularly challenge for institutions that have models. Then moving on to just more generic challenges, and we outline here counterparty credit risk, but counterparty credit risk in particular is requiring much more data than was required in the past. Some of these data do exist within core rep returns, some others do not exist in the form that is being required. And there's a lot of questions around where are you getting this data from. If it's coming from reg returns, then fine, you're probably a bit more comfortable with the information. If it's coming from underlying systems, are these systems a golden source, or do you need to just assess the completeness and accuracy of that data? So that continues. I mean, particularly in some of the jurisdictions where you do not have an audit requirement around some of these components, there's a big question mark around how you can make sure that this data is complete and accurate. Then FINREP is another challenge to throw in the mix. Basically, there are some definitions in FINREP that overlap with definitions within Pillar 3, but there's the broader question around how do you compare data between FINREP, CoreREP, Pillar 3? Are you using the same data source, or are you making sure that you are actually reconciling the right numbers together? The challenges that we are seeing kind of exasperating this is first of all, is the timing. The convergence of the Pillar 3 to the financial timeline is proving difficult. So some of the financial statement timelines or timeframes are quite tight. Getting Pillar 3 published at the same time is not an easy task. Most institutions in the past used to do that post their financial statements. Now they're having to do it concurrently. The other one is frequency, which we touched on briefly before, but more generally, there's an expectation of more senior involvement within Pillar 3 with a written attestation from senior officers, as well as there's an expectation of the control framework to be robust and operating effectively, again, similar to what you'd expect from financial reporting. So long gone the days where we had a financial office or an officer within finance sitting in the corner pulling this together and then presenting it. It does require senior involvement, and senior management need to be very comfortable with the information that's being presented to the public. So these are the key messages from a phase 1. I'll move swiftly to phase 2. Again, as we've done on phase 1, and if you look at phase 2, there's a lot of new topics in there. Again, 29 templates in total, semi-annual and annual frequency, but again, some are quarterly. So the two kind of key things to flag there is much more work to get ready, much more recurrent publication of Pillar 3, which will add to the challenge. But then if you think of the phase 2, and if we step back from these different topics, the key challenge in that phase is going to be we have a lot of new topics that are still being considered from a technical perspective and have a lot of challenges that institutions have not resolved yet, and a lot of clarifications from the regulator. And almost all of these templates are required to be reported as part of the second phase. So what we expect to see is as more institutions will evolve their thinking around these topics, some of these will become easier, but in the meantime, this is very challenging. We have highlighted, the key metrics one is an interesting one, where you are required to have a summary table talking about all your key regulatory metrics. I personally think this is useful, and I think probably institutions would agree with that. But then when we delve into MREL, TLAC, ranking of and creditors hierarchy, eligible liabilities, etc. This becomes quite an in-depth topic that requires technical expertise. Similarly, for market and operational risk, the granular disclosure required there are not something that was required before, and with the changes in the calculation methodologies and all the changes in that Martin mentioned at the beginning of these slides, this will have to be transposed within Pillar 3, which is proving difficult. IRRBB, we know there are some challenges around the shock scenarios, as well as around the economic value of equity and net interest income. So all those, again, just kind of are emphasizing the fact that institutions, as well as the regulator, need to go through some of these technical challenges first before there's further clarity on the Pillar 3 disclosures. However, another challenge where institutions are considering is when you report your hypothetical RWA, what's the use in having IRB numbers, and will that just kind of be the de facto number that most of the investors will look into, thus kind of reducing the emphasis of the models. This is kind of one big one, which I know that's not the intention of that publication within Pillar 3, but it might be a consequence. The other thing that institutions are thinking about, which I encourage you to do so, is how would you gradually communicate these changes? Because there are big impacts within each one of these topics alone, let alone combined. So do you want to wait until the formal publication is required as part of Pillar 3, or are there snippets of what you are doing and what you are expecting in terms of impact that you would like to early disclose? So that's in a nutshell in terms of the second phase. What I'll do now is I'll hand over to Rivaan. Rivaan is going to articulate or give us a flavor of the European implementation of the phase 1.
Thanks, Peter. So if we think about this from a European perspective, Peter outlined the various phases of the Basel package to revise Pillar 3. In December last year, the EBA published final guidelines which covered phase 1 of the Pillar 3 framework. So those are the 48 templates that Peter mentioned earlier. If we take a step back broadly, the purpose of the EBA guidelines is really just to allow the Pillar 3 framework to be implemented in a consistent way throughout the European Union, and to allow for compatibility with the current disclosure requirements, which are captured in Part 8 of the Capital Requirements Regulation, CRR. The highlights from the EBA guideline to mention are firstly in terms of its scope. So the EBA noted that at this early stage, the scope of application is being limited to global systemically important institutions, the so-called G size, and other systemically important institutions, the so-called O size. But importantly, the guidelines also mention that any other institution may be opted into the scope of the guidelines by a national competent authority. So effectively what that means is that while the guidelines are required for G size and O size, the various national regulators have the power or the discretion to opt any other firm into the requirements. Interestingly, to that point, we are aware, at least in the UK and the ECB in some cases, have asked for the larger banks to at least disclose some parts of the guidelines for their 2016 reporting, whereas the guidelines have asked for the timing of the disclosures to come in for the year ending 2017. So that's the guidelines very broadly. Timing for year ends 2017 for G size and O size, but supervisors have discretion, and banks are, at least the larger ones, are being encouraged to disclose with their current 2016 reporting. This slide 10, captures the so-called CRD5/CRR II package, which was introduced at the end of last year in November. And a key feature across the CRD5 package was really the introduction of greater levels of proportionality across multiple aspects. And this theme carried through in terms of the Pillar 3 requirements. The disclosure regime that CRR II envisages takes into account the relative size and complexity of firms, and what it does really is classifies them into defined prescribed categories based on their size, with a further distinction between those that are listed and non-listed. Interestingly, the disclosure requirements will apply to firms based on what is really a sliding scale basis, which differentiates between the nature and frequency of disclosures, and that's captured in the graphic on the slide. At the upper end of the scale, large institutions with listed securities will really need to provide annual disclosures of all parts of the disclosure requirements, but also disclosures of selected information on a semi-annual and on a quarterly basis. Whereas on the lower end of the scale, small, non-listed firms will really only be required to make selected disclosures around areas such as governance, remuneration, risk management, and the new key metrics table. Depending on the final form of the CRR II package, clearly proportionality is something that will be welcomed by some institutions, particularly the mid-tier institutions, and it will be interesting to see how this evolves. But in the meantime, I think between the EBA guidelines and the CRR II proposals, firms should have a good sense around what the new disclosure regime is going to look like, and they should probably start, if they haven't already, thinking about assessing in detail how they will be producing some of these new fixed format disclosures and operationalizing some of the processes to produce these new formats Pillar 3 reports. So I'll hand back to Peter to really just wrap up and summarize the discussion so far.
Thank you, Rivaan. I really do think, I mean, there are a number of benefits, I suppose, from the new Pillar 3 disclosure requirements. If one kind of steps away from it, I suppose it will be a useful document for investors to consider, to look into some of the information at a granular level, actually. I mean, if you speak to investors, they'd welcome these changes. However, the thing to highlight for firms in particular is the task is a big one. So even if we think of phases of the phases that are going to change, like phase 1, the number of templates required, the number of information and data permutation required, the assessments around completeness and accuracy of the data that's being published are all additional burden on firms and something that will take time to establish and get right. So if you haven't started thinking about working through your program on Pillar 3, then you should definitely start thinking about it now. I know probably the larger institutions are just a bit ahead because of the early implementation, but irrespective, if you are captured within these requirements, this is something you need to focus on immediately. And another thing really to highlight is this is information that is going to go out to the public. So it is something that you will be challenged on. It is something that the public might compare information across institutions and come up with additional questions. So the investors, I know, will be particularly keen to do so. So thank you for listening in. I'll just hand over to Martin now to just kind of finalize the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Rivaan. I think this was really a perfect presentation and gives a complete overview of what the challenges for our clients are. In the end, there's only one thing that I would like to mention as an example why disclosure becomes so important. First, we will have more frequent disclosures. So there will be definitely more data available, and it's comparable because all banks will have to use almost the same templates, not only on European level, but also on a global level. And this opens up complete new opportunities for people who analyzes data. In my first career, I developed the rating systems, and I also was responsible for the development of rating systems for other institutions, for banks. And actually, I must say, this is like a dream comes true, because when you have of all institutions on European level or even on global level, data available that is comparable, it gives a complete new opportunity for the development of new internal rating models for institutions and for banks. So it's definitely important that banks have to take care of the new disclosure requirements and send high quality data and high quality disclosure reports to the public in the future. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any further questions, do not hesitate to contact us. Our contact details can be seen on this slide or below this video, so we will be very happy to support you in your disclosure projects. Thank you very much again, and bye-bye.